Loud noises can make the crappies stop feeding or even spook them out of a location. A tightline rig does several important things. A heavy sinker keeps your bait, usually a minnow, down near the bottom and in the cover. That's where the crappies are. The sinker also keeps your line tight so you can feel the faint tap of a crappie strike, especially if you hold your finger on the line. The purpose of having two hooks is not to catch two fish at once, but to help you find the depth crappies are feeding at. Sometimes crappies feed down near the bottom. Other times crappies feed a few feet up from the bottom. They may not move more than a few inches to go after a bait, so having bait at two different levels increases your odds of catching fish. The tightline rig helps you fish in submerged cover. When you do get snagged, and you will, you simply bounce the rig up and down, and the sinker pulls the hook out of the snag. Sometimes the light wire hooks bend and pull free from the snag. You can just bend the hook back in shape, or slip it off and put on a new one. But most important, a tightline rig on a long rod helps you find crappie holding cover and stay in that cover. With a little practice, you can actually feel what your sinker is bumping into. Just hop the rig up and down a couple of inches as you drift or slowly troll along. There is a difference between the feel of your sinker falling into soft mud, brushing up against branches, or tapping onto a hard stump or log. When crappies are hanging tight to cover, you want your bait to be right up against a tree or right in the branches. That's how you put more fish in the boat. On a big body of water, finding the right spot to fish for crappies can be a real challenge. Use the depth finder to make sure you're over fish or good fish holding cover. The markers you put out will help you stay on the spot you want to fish. Work the area slowly and thoroughly. By learning to fish a tight line rig, you'll increase your odds of consistently catching crappies. We've shown you that crappies don't just disappear in the summer. By using the formula for success, you can find some great summertime slab fishing in reservoirs. And if you want to fish natural lakes in the summer, you'll learn how to do it in the next part of this program. In natural lakes, as in reservoirs, crappies use deeper water in the summer than the spring. Often you'll fish for them 10 to 20 feet below the surface. In natural lakes, look for crappies in 3 key locations: up in the weeds, suspended a ways out from the base of the weed line, and suspended over deep rock piles or places where the bottom drops off, also known as a break line. Before you start fishing, spend some time getting to know the lake. Scout the weeds, the weed line, and the break line with your depth finder. Cruise the shoreline area of the lake with a zigzag pattern. In natural lakes, crappies are often found in weeds with broad, curly leaves, commonly known as cabbage or pond weed. As you run the boat in from deeper water, you'll notice that the weeds start growing at a certain depth. That's the weed line. The weed line is the point where light levels are just sufficient for plant growth. Crappies and many other species of game fish are often in locations close to the weed line. Once you start finding fish, keep on scouting for a while to establish a pattern. What depth are the crappies using? Are they bunched up in big schools or scattered in little schools? The pattern you find will help you decide which presentation to use. Let's say you've marked a big school of crappies off the weed line on a large point. You could use a jig or a small crankbait to fish for those crappies. In either case, you could use the countdown method to fish the lure without a bobber. Cast to where you expect the crappies to be. As the lure sinks, count slowly. 1, 2, 3, and then start retrieving. Use a slow, steady retrieve. Keep the slack out of your line so you can feel the faint tap of a crappie taking your lure. Make several casts in the area, always counting down to the same depth before you start retrieving. Then, count a little higher to let the lure fall deeper. Eventually, you'll find the depth crappies are feeding at. Then you can keep on counting down your lure to the same depth. If you can stay right over the crappies, vertical jigging is a very effective technique. Use a 1/16 or 1/32 ounce jig. Sometimes you'll get more strikes if you hook a minnow on the jig. Use your height plus the length of the rod to quickly and easily judge how deep you will let the jig fall. Let the jig fall to the depth at which you found the crappies on the depth finder. Jig it slowly up and down at that depth. Lower the rod tip at the same speed the jig falls so you don't get slack in your line. Watch the line closely. Sometimes a slight twitch in the line is the only strike signal you get that a crappie has taken your lure. If you're not finding schools of fish in open water, you may want to spend some time searching the weeds for crappies. A small crappie spinner is good for this kind of location. Cast it right into the cabbage weeds. For the best action, retrieve the spinner slowly over the tops of the weeds, then let it drop down into the weeds. Cast out again to a different spot in the weeds. Retrieve and drop. Keep the slack out of your line because crappies will often strike as the lure is falling. Sometimes you'll see a school of fish suspended over deep water, not relating to any apparent cover. They could be crappies. Maneuver your boat to stay close to the crappies. Toss out a marker buoy to identify the spot. Drop the marker after you've passed over the school. Don't drop your anchor down through the fish because that could spook them. Use a simple presentation, a minnow on a hook with a small sinker about 6 inches up from the hook. Let the bait drop slowly down into the school of crappies. When you catch a crappie, you want to be able to get your lure or bait back down to where you caught the fish because there are probably more crappies at that depth. Crappies suspended over deep water are usually not feeding actively. They're tough to catch. And sometimes staying over a moving school of fish can be difficult. But with the formula for success and a little patience and concentration, you can master the challenge of summertime crappie fishing.